Some properties sell for pennies on the dollar, not because they're falling apart, but because of what people believe happened inside them. In the spring of 1987, Gary Nose learned this lesson when he bought 60 acres of Montana rangeland for $300. The real estate agent wouldn't even step foot on the property. The previous owner's family practically threw the deed at him. And the locals, they'd cross the street rather than talk about the old Barnett homestead. Gary thought they were all superstitious fools. He was a practical man, a horse rancher who'd spent 30 years working the land, and he didn't believe in ghosts. What he did believe in was opportunity. $300 for land that should have cost him $50,000. That was the deal of a lifetime. But Gary's horse, Harley, knew something he didn't. Horses have instincts that we've long forgotten. They sense things we can't see, hear frequencies beyond our range, and detect fear in the ground itself. And from the moment Harley's hooves touched that property, he knew that some secrets aren't meant to stay buried. What Gary would find in the spring of 1987 wouldn't just change his understanding of the Barnett family. It would reveal a truth that had been hidden for 43 years. One that explained every whisper, every rumor, and every terrified look that had kept people away from this land for nearly half a century. Gary Nose had been looking for expansion land for his horse operation for 3 years. His current property, 40 mi south of Great Falls, Montana, was getting cramped. He had 23 horses, a growing breeding program, and dreams of taking on rescue horses that needed rehabilitation. What he needed was space. What he got was the Barnett place. The listing came across his desk on a Tuesday morning in March. The real estate agent, a woman named Claire Webb, had called him directly. Her voice in the phone was strained, almost urgent. "Mr. Nose, I have a property you might be interested in. 160 acres, partially fenced with a main house, a barn, and a smaller outbuilding. The seller is motivated. Very motivated." Gary had learned that motivated was real estate code for desperate, which usually meant he could negotiate. But even he wasn't prepared for what came next. "What's the asking price?" he'd asked, already running numbers in his head. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. $300, Gary had laughed. He'd actually laughed out loud. "Claire, you said 160 acres, not 16 square F, right?" "I'm serious, Mr. Nose. The heirs want it gone. They want it gone today, if possible." That's when Gary should have known something was wrong. But he was a practical man. And practical men don't turn down opportunities because of a feeling. He drove out that afternoon, Claire following in her own car because she refused to ride with him. The property was located in the middle of the Montana prairie, accessible by a dirt road that hadn't been maintained in what looked like decades. Sagebrush crowded the path. The wooden gate at the entrance hung at an angle, attached by only one rusted hinge. The main house was a 2-story farmhouse built in what Gary guessed was the early 1900s. White paint peeled from the wooden siding in long strips, revealing gray weathered boards beneath. The windows were intact but filthy, making it impossible to see inside. The porch sagged in the middle, and the front door stood slightly ajar as if waiting. The barn was in better condition, surprisingly. It was a classic Montana barn, red paint faded to a dusty pink, with a gamble roof and a wide central aisle. The doors were closed, but not locked. Gary could see that the structure was sound, the foundation solid, but it was the smaller building that caught his attention. Set about 50 yards from the main house, it was a stone structure, maybe 12 FD x 12 FD, with a heavy wooden door that had been padlocked and chained. Someone had driven thick metal stakes into the ground on either side of the door and wrapped the chains around both the stakes and the door handle, securing it in place with not one but 3 separate padlocks. "What's that building?" Gary had asked, pointing. Claire, who had stayed in her car with the engine running, rolled down her window just enough to answer. "I don't know." The family never said. I never asked. And the price is definitely $300. For all of this? Yes. They just want someone to take it. They're prepared to sign the deed over today. Right now, actually. Gary had walked the property for an hour, while Claire waited in her car. The land was beautiful, rolling prairie with good grass and a seasonal creek that ran along the eastern boundary. The fencing needed work, but was salvageable. There was an old windmill, rusted but potentially functional. This wasn't haunted land. This was opportunity. He signed the papers that evening. The seller's representative, a lawyer named Donovan, met them at Claire's office with the deed already prepared. Donovan was a thin man in his 60s who kept glancing at his watch as if he had somewhere urgent to be. The transaction took 11 minutes. The property is sold as is, Donovan had said, pushing the deed across the desk. No warranties, no disclosures beyond what's required by law. The seller's family requests that you don't attempt to contact them. Do you understand? Gary had nodded, signed his name, and walked out with ownership of 160 acres for less than the cost of a used saddle. He should have asked more questions, but hindsight is clearer than foresight, and Gary was too busy planning his future to wonder about the past. Gary brought Harley to the property 3 days later. He'd spent the intervening time cleaning out the barn, checking the fences, and making a list of immediate repairs. The house could wait. He'd need major work before it was livable. But the barn was solid. He could start moving horses within the week. Harley was a 10-year-old quarter horse, a blood bay gelling with a white star on his forehead, and intelligence in his eyes that bordered on uncanny. Gary had raised him from a foe, trained him personally, and trusted him more than most people he knew. Harley was calm, steady, and completely unflappable. Gary had ridden him through lightning storms, across rivers swollen with spring runoff, and past rattlesnakes coiled on the trail. Harley never spooked until they crossed onto the Barnett property. The moment Harley's hooves touched the dirt road leading to the homestead, his entire demeanor changed. His ears pinned back, his nostrils flared, and he began to sidestep, fighting the reins. Gary felt the horse's muscles tense beneath him, every nerve on high alert. "Easy, boy," Gary said, patting Harley's neck. "It's just a new place. Nothing to worry about." But Harley didn't calm. If anything, he became more agitated as they approached the buildings. When Gary tried to ride him toward the barn, Harley planted his feet and refused to move forward. Gary, increasingly frustrated, dismounted and tried to lead him. Harley pulled back so hard, he nearly ripped the rez from Gary's hands. "What has gotten into you?" Gary muttered. He managed to get Harley into the barn, but the horse was sweating, his eyes rolling, his breathing rapid. Gary had never seen him like this. He tied him loosely to a post, thinking maybe the horse just needed time to adjust, and went back to work on the fence repairs. 20 minutes later, he heard the commotion. Harley was pulling against his lead rope, neck stretched, muscles straining. The post he was tied to was actually starting to shift in the ground from the force of his pulling. Gary ran to him, afraid the horse would hurt himself. "Harley, stop." But Harley wasn't trying to escape randomly. He was pulling in a specific direction toward that small stone building. Gary untied him, thinking maybe he could hand-walk the horse around the property to settle him down. But the moment he loosened the rope, Harley didn't bolt away from the stone building. He moved toward it, pulling Gary along, nostrils flared, ears forward now. Every sense focused on that padlocked door. When they got within 10 feet of the structure, Harley stopped. He stretched his neck out, sniffing the air around the door. Then he did something Gary had never seen a horse do in 30 years of working with them. Harley began to dig. His front hoof struck the ground in front of the stone building. Once, twice, 3 times. Not panicked pawing, but deliberate focused digging, like he was trying to tell Gary something, like he was trying to show him something. Gary pulled him away, but Harley fought him every step. It took all of Gary's strength to get the horse back to the trailer. And when he did, Harley stood at the trailer door, looking back at that stone building, nickering softly. That night, Gary couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Harley's behavior, the horses' fear when they'd arrived, but then that strange focus on the stone building, the digging, the way Harley seemed to be trying to communicate something. He also couldn't stop thinking about the chains on that door, about the 3 padlocks, about the fact that the real estate agent didn't know what the building was for, about the way the seller's family had wanted him gone, wanted the property gone, wanted everything about this place to just disappear. The next morning, Gary drove into town. The nearest community was Dutton, population 387, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed immediately. Gary stopped at the diner on Main Street, a place called Betty's, where the coffee was strong and the gossip was stronger. He sat at the counter and ordered breakfast. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a bun, took his order without comment. But when he mentioned he'd bought the old Barnett place, she went white. "You bought what?" she whispered. "The Barnett homestead out on County Road 47. The diner went quiet, not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had thrown a switch. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Every eye in the room turned to look at Gary. "You shouldn't have done that," the waitress said softly. "Nobody should live there." "Why not? What happened there?" She shook her head. "I'll get your eggs." Gary tried to engage other customers in conversation, but no one would talk to him. They'd nod politely, make excuses, and turn away. It was as if he'd contracted something contagious just by buying that property. He finally found someone willing to talk at the gas station. An old rancher named Pete Hoffman, who was filling up his truck, gave Gary a long, appraising look when he introduced himself. "You're the fool who bought the Barnett place," Pete said. "It wasn't a question." "I'm the businessman who bought quality land for a fair price," Gary corrected. Pete laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Fair, son? That land isn't worth the paper the deed's printed on." Thomas Barnett disappeared from that property in 1944. Just vanished. His wife Clara went crazy looking for him. Spent every day for 3 years searching. She died in 47. Some say of a broken heart, but others say it was guilt. Guilt over what? Nobody knows for sure. But after she died, their children boarded up the property and left. None of them would even come back for visits. The land sat empty for 40 years. People who've walked that property say they hear things, voices, footsteps. Some say they've seen Thomas Barnett's ghost walking the fence line at dusk. "I don't believe in ghosts," Gary said. Neither did the last 3 people who tried to work that land. They all left within a week. Said it wasn't right. That place said something was wrong with it down in the bones of the earth itself. Gary thanked Pete and left, but the old man's words stayed with him. More troubling was the detail he'd learned. Thomas Barnett had disappeared in 1944. That was 43 years ago, and no one had ever found a body. No one had ever found an explanation. That evening, Gary returned to the property. He brought tools this time, bolt cutters and a crowbar. He'd had enough of mysteries and superstitions. If everyone was so terrified of this place, if the building was so important that it needed to be sealed with 3 padlocks and chains, then there had to be something inside. And Gary was going to find out what it was. Harley was in the trailer behind his truck. He'd brought the horse despite the earlier reaction, thinking maybe Harley could sense something Gary couldn't. As they pulled up to the property, Harley began nickering again. That same urgent sound from before. Gary unloaded him and walked him toward the stone building. This time, Harley didn't fight. He walked beside Gary calmly, purposefully, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. When they reached the building, Harley did that same digging motion with his front hoof. 3 deliberate strikes against the ground. Right in front of the door, Gary examined the chains in the fading light. They were old, the metal pitted with rust, but still strong. The padlocks were vintage, probably from the 1940s. Someone had secured this building and meant for it to stay secured. He positioned the bolt cutters on the first padlock and squeezed. The lock resisted, then gave way with a crack that echoed across the prairie. Harley's ears swiveled forward. Gary cut the second lock, then the third. The chains fell away, clattering against the door. His hand was on the door handle when Harley nudged him hard with his nose. Gary turned to look at the horse. Harley was staring at him, and Gary would swear, later, that there was something almost human in that gaze. A warning maybe, or a plea. The horse snickered once, softly. "I know, boy," Gary said, "but we've come this far." He pulled the door open. The smell hit him first. Not decay or death as he'd half expected, but something else. Mineral oil, metal, and underneath it all, something earthy and old. Gary pulled a flashlight from his belt and shone it into the darkness. The building was a single room, roughly 12 feet square, with a dirt floor and stone walls. There was no furniture, no storage, nothing that would explain why it needed to be locked so thoroughly. The beam of his flashlight swept across empty space, dust motes dancing in the light. Gary was about to leave, convinced he'd wasted his time when Harley pushed past him into the building. The horse walked directly to the center of the room and began to dig, his front hooves churning up the packed earth with surprising force. "Harley, stop." But the horse wouldn't stop. He dug with an urgency that bordered on frantic dirt flying behind him. Gary grabbed his lead rope and tried to pull him away, but Harley was 1,200 lb of determined animal, and Gary couldn't budge him. Then, Gary saw it. A flash of something in the dirt. Something that wasn't dirt. He knelt down and brushed away the loose earth Harley had exposed. His fingers touched metal. Cold, smooth metal. It took Gary 40 minutes to excavate what Harley had found. It was a metal box approximately 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2 feet deep. Made of heavy steel, it had been wrapped in oilcloth and buried about 18 in below the surface. The box had a simple latch, no lock, as if the chains on the door had been the only security needed. Gary dragged the box outside into the last light of day. Harley stood beside him, calm now, watching with those intelligent eyes. Gary opened the box. Inside were layers of oilcloth, wrapped carefully around the contents. He peeled them back one by one, his heart pounding. When he reached the center, he found 3 things. The first was a journal, leather-bound and remarkably well preserved. The name embossed on the cover read Thomas Barnett, 1944. The second was a collection of documents yellowed with age but still legible. Legal papers, deeds, contracts. The third was a leather pouch that jingled when Gary lifted it. He opened it and stared. Gold coins. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They spilled into his palm, catching the sunset light. Gary sat back on his heels, overwhelmed. Then, he opened the journal. The first entry was dated January 15th, 1944. "I'm writing this because if something happens to me, someone needs to know the truth. My name is Thomas Barnett, and I've been a coward for 22 years. In 1922, I did something that has haunted me every day since this journal is my confession." Gary read. As the sun set and the stars came out, Harley stood guard beside him, occasionally nudging his shoulder as if to make sure he was still there. Thomas Barnett's story unfolded across the pages in neat, precise handwriting. In 1922, Thomas had been a young man working as a clerk at the Great Falls Bank. During a routine audit, he discovered that the bank manager, a man named Edward Carrillet, had been embezzling funds for years. Carrillet had stolen over $200,000, a fortune, in 1922, and had hidden it so cleverly that no one else had noticed. Thomas had confronted Carrillet, intending to report him, but Carrillet had made him an offer. Split the money, keep quiet, and both of them would walk away rich. Carrillet would forge the books to cover the theft, framing a recently deceased accountant for the crime. No one would ever know. Thomas had said yes. God help him, he'd said yes. They'd split the money. Carrillet had taken cash and fled west to California. Thomas had been more cautious, converting his share to gold over several years, never spending too much at once, never drawing attention. He'd used some of it to buy his homestead, to build his life, to marry Clara. But the guilt had consumed him. Every time he looked at Clara, he saw the weight of his lie. Every time he walked his land, he remembered that it was bought with stolen money. The ghost that haunted the Barnett homestead wasn't Thomas Barnett's spirit, it was his guilty conscience. The journal entries grew more tortured as the years passed. By 1943, Thomas was suffering from what Gary recognized as severe depression. He wrote about nightmares, about sleepless nights, about the certainty that he would be discovered, and that his family would be destroyed by his crime. The final entries written in March 1944 were different. Thomas had made a decision. I've hidden everything in the stone building, the gold, the documents proving what I did. This journal, I've sealed it with every lock and chain I can find. Clara can never know. The children can never know. The shame would destroy them. Tomorrow, I'm going to turn myself in to the authorities in Great Falls. I'll tell them everything. I'll spend the rest of my life in prison if I have to. But I can't carry this secret anymore. The gold will stay buried. Maybe someday someone will find it and put it to better use than I ever could. But my family will be free of it. Free of the curse it's brought upon us. The journal ended there. There were no more entries. Gary looked up from the pages, his mind racing. Thomas Barnett had intended to turn himself in. He'd buried the evidence, sealed the building, and planned to confess, but he'd never made it to Great Falls. Gary spent the next 3 days researching. He drove to Great Falls and searched through old newspaper archives at the public library. He found the story of Thomas Barnett's disappearance on page 3 of the April 12, 1944 edition of the Great Falls Tribune. Local rancher missing. Thomas Barnett, 44 of Dutton, has been missing since March 28. His wife Clara reported him missing after he failed to return home from a business trip to Great Falls. Authorities say there is no evidence of foul play. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Cascade County Sheriff's Department. There were follow-up articles over the next few months. Search parties had scoured the route between Dutton and Great Falls. Clara had offered a reward, but Thomas Barnett was never found. Gary dug deeper, requesting police records through a formal records request. When they arrived 2 weeks later, they contained a detail that made his blood run cold. Thomas Barnett's truck had been found abandoned on a remote stretch of highway between Dutton and Great Falls. The truck was undamaged, the keys still in the ignition. There were no signs of a struggle, but there were indications that someone else had been there. Tire tracks from a second vehicle. Footprints that didn't match Thomas's boots. The investigating officer's notes speculated that Thomas might have been picked up by someone he knew. The case had been investigated as a possible murder, but without a body or suspects, it had eventually gone cold. Gary returned to the homestead with a heavy heart. He understood now. Thomas Barnett had left to turn himself in, to confess his crime, and accept the consequences. But he'd never made it. Someone had stopped him. Gary sat on the porch of the old farmhouse as the sun set, the journal open in his lap. Harley grazed nearby. Content now that the secret was uncovered. Who stopped you, Thomas? Gary asked the empty air. Who knew you were going to confess? Then it hit him. The answer had been in the journal all along. Edward Carroll, the bank manager who'd orchestrated the original theft. Carroll had fled to California in 1922. But what if he'd kept tabs on Thomas? What if he'd learned that Thomas was planning to confess? A confession would expose not just Thomas, but Carroll too. It would bring Carroll back to Montana to face trial. Gary went back to the library. This time, he searched for Edward Carrille. He found a death certificate dated 1967. Carrille had died in Sacramento, California, a wealthy man. In his obituary, there was a detail that Gary almost missed. Mr. Carrille made his fortune in the automobile business and was known for his frequent trips to Montana to visit family in the 1940s. The pieces fell into place. Carrille had been watching Thomas. When Thomas sealed up the evidence and prepared to confess, Carrille had intercepted him. And then Thomas Barnett had disappeared. Gary would never be able to prove it, not after so many years. But he knew the truth now. Thomas Barnett hadn't been haunted by supernatural forces. He'd been hunted by his own guilty past and silenced by a man who had as much to lose as he did. Gary spent weeks deciding what to do with his discovery. The gold alone was worth over $300,000 in 1989. He could keep it, sell it quietly, and no one would ever know. The statute of limitations on the original theft had long since expired. There was no legal obligation to report what he'd found. But there was a moral one. He thought about Thomas Barnett, a man so consumed by guilt that he'd been willing to sacrifice everything to make things right. A man who'd been murdered before he could earn his redemption. Thomas deserved better than to have his story end with his secret still buried. Gary contacted a lawyer, then the Montana Attorney General's office. He turned over everything, the journal, the documents, and yes, the gold. He told them the whole story from the $300 purchase to Harley's discovery. The case made national news. Horse uncovers 43-year-old mystery, read the headline in the New York Times. The FBI reopened the investigation into Thomas Barnett's disappearance. Though with both Thomas and Edward Carreel long dead, they acknowledged that no charges would ever be filed. The gold was another matter. After months of legal wrangling, a judge ruled that since the original theft had occurred from a bank that no longer existed, and since all parties involved were deceased, the gold would be used to establish a victims' compensation fund for bank fraud victims in Montana. Thomas Barnett's name would be on the fund, a permanent reminder of a man who tried to make amends. Clara Barnett had died in 1947, but Thomas and Clara's children were still alive. 3 of them, now in their 60s and 70s, attended a private meeting with Gary. He gave them their father's journal to read. Their reactions were complex. Anger at what their father had done. Grief for what he'd suffered. Relief at finally understanding why he'd disappeared, and why their mother had spent her last years in such torment. The oldest son, Robert, a retired teacher living in Billings, shook Gary's hand with tears in his eyes. "All these years we thought he'd abandoned us," Robert said. "We thought he'd run away because he didn't love us. To know that he was trying to make things right, that someone stopped him from coming home. It doesn't make it better exactly, but it makes sense. The family didn't want the property. They asked Gary to keep it, to make something good of it. He agreed. Gary developed the Barnett homestead into something Thomas would have been proud of. He established a rescue operation for abused and neglected horses, using both the homestead and his original property. He called it Second Chances Ranch after Thomas's attempt to make amends, and after the horses he was saving. The old farmhouse was restored and converted into a small museum telling Thomas Barnett's story, a cautionary tale about the weight of guilty secrets and the price of redemption. School groups visit to learn about ethics, consequences, and the importance of honesty. The stone building where the secret was buried was left standing, but the door was removed. Inside, there's now a plaque that reads, "In memory of Thomas Barnett, 1900 to 1944. He tried to make things right. May we all have such courage." As for Harley, he became something of a celebrity. News crews came to film the horse who'd solved a 43-year-old mystery. Gary was offered substantial sums of money for him by collectors who wanted to own the famous detective horse. Gary turned them all down. Harley wasn't for sale. He never had been. Gary would tell visitors who came to the ranch. Somehow, he knew that secret was there, and he knew it needed to be found. Horses can sense things we can't. They're connected to the land in ways we've forgotten how to be. The Barnett homestead isn't haunted anymore, at least not in the way people thought it was. Oh, there are still stories. People say that on certain spring evenings, when the light is just right, you can see a figure walking the fence line. But those who've seen it say the figure isn't restless or angry. It's peaceful, almost content. Gary doesn't talk about it much, but he's seen it too. Just once, 3 years after he made the discovery, he was working late, fixing a section of fence near the old stone building when he felt a presence, not threatening, just there. He looked up and saw a man standing about 50 yards away watching him work. The man was wearing clothes from another era, and even from that distance, Gary could see the look of gratitude on his face. Gary blinked, and the figure was gone. Whether it was Thomas Barnett's spirit finally at peace, or just a trick of the light and a tired man's imagination, Gary couldn't say. But he likes to think that Thomas knows what happened to his property. Knows that something good came from his tragedy. Knows that his story helped people understand the cost of secrets and the value of truth. Harley lived to be 28 years old, an impressive age for a horse. He spent his retirement grazing the fields of the Barnett homestead, teaching younger rescue horses how to trust humans again. When he passed away in 2005, Gary buried him on the property not far from the stone building where he'd made his famous discovery. The headstone reads Harley 1977 to 2005. He found what was lost. Second Chances Ranch is still operating today. 38 years after Gary bought the property for $300, it saved over $2,000 horses in that time, giving abused, neglected, and abandoned animals a place to heal and find new homes. The ranch is run by Gary's daughter now. Gary retired in 2010, but still visits weekly. When people ask about the property's history, about the haunted homestead, and the $300 purchase, Gary tells them the truth. It was never haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by a secret, by guilt that couldn't rest, by a truth that needed to be told, and it took a horse to find it. Because sometimes, the things we bury don't stay buried. Sometimes, they call out to be found, to be brought into the light, to be made right. We just need to pay attention to those who can hear the call. Thomas Barnett never got his chance at redemption while he was alive. But in death, his story became a powerful lesson. His gold helped victims of fraud. His property became a sanctuary for broken animals. His journal taught thousands of students about the importance of honesty and the weight of moral choices. In the end, Thomas Barnett did make things right. He just needed help from a practical rancher who saw opportunity where others saw curses, and from a horse who understood that some secrets need to be unearthed. The Barnett homestead taught Gary Noce something important. That what seems like a curse is sometimes just an unfinished story waiting for its ending. That redemption is possible even decades after the sin. That truth, no matter how buried, will eventually find its way to the surface. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to search a little deeper, and sometimes a horse that already knows exactly where the truth is buried. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Stories for Horseback. Here, we bring you powerful, emotional stories about horses and the extraordinary ways they change human lives every single day. Share this video with someone who loves horses, believes in second chances, or enjoys a good mystery filled with redemption and hope. And don't forget to tell us in the comments, what country are you watching from? We'd love to see how far our Stories for Horseback family reaches around the world. Also, do you believe horses can sense things we cannot? Have you ever witnessed an animal act in a way that felt impossible to explain? We truly enjoy reading your experiences and connecting with this amazing community. Until next time, remember that the greatest mysteries aren't always solved by the most educated minds, but by those who trust their instincts and respect the quiet wisdom of animals. Thank you for being part of Stories for Horseback, and we'll see you in the next story.